Good evening and welcome to the Buddhist Insights at Empty Cloud channel here for our regular Wednesday evening live stream. This time discussing a sutta as we normally do on one of the discourses of the Buddha. And so shortly we will begin talking about this. So just say hello to anyone who's joining in now or who might be watching this later on. I hope you're doing well and that your practice is going well. And today we'll be covering the Nāgitasutta, which is Anguttara Nikaya 6.42, which I believe you should be able to find in the description of the video. I didn't make the video, so I'm not sure, but I assume that it's there. And so we will go ahead and go through one of the discourses of the Buddha today, the Nāgitasutta. And before we do, how about we just start with just a few minutes of meditation just to settle the mind before we begin talking about the sutta in particular. And hello to Brian and to Mary and to Maria who are joining in live, and anyone else who might be joining in live. Okay, so let's just take a few moments. We can just close our eyes and set our posture in a way that's upright and alert with a relaxed body, with our hands in our lap, and we can just take a few deep breaths, intentional deep breaths, filling in with air and bringing in awareness and noticing the silence while you're breathing in, and then exhaling, relaxing your whole body while maintaining your posture. Inhaling and exhaling out all the stress and tension. Inhaling and we can exhale and just let the breath return to its natural pace. Just noticing the natural rhythm of the breathing. And just allow your attention to settle on your body. Noticing the sensation of your body sitting and breathing. The sensation of being in the room where you are. And just cultivating a sense of present moment awareness. Just curious and content to be aware of what's present right here in your body and in your environment. And you can naturally just notice the breathing. Just like waves coming in on a shore or a nice breeze, just notice the breathing coming in and flowing out. Letting your mind settle down and kindly and interestingly observe that process of breathing. Relaxing body and mind. Okay, and at this time I will go ahead and begin talking about the sutta. So if you'd like, you can continue meditating. You can keep your eyes closed. And if you would prefer, you don't have to, you can open them. But we can just try to maintain this mindfulness. Okay, so I'll render homage to the Buddha and then we can get started. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang saranang gacchami. Okay, good evening to everyone else who joined in. So this is the Nāgitasutta, as I mentioned, with Nāgita. And I'll be reading mostly from Bhante Sujato's translation and maybe making any edits that we need to from the Pali. So it begins. Eva me sutang, so I have heard. At one time, the Buddha was wandering in the land of the Kosalans, together with a large sangha of mendicants, when he arrived at a village of the Kosalan Brahmins named Ichanangala. He stayed in a forest near Ichanangala. The Brahmins and householders of Ichanangala heard. It seems the ascetic Gotama, a Sakyan gone forth from a Sakyan family, has arrived at Ichanangala. He is staying in a forest near Ichanangala. He has this good reputation. That blessed one is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide for those who wish to train, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, blessed. He has realized with his own insight this world, with its gods, matas, and divinities, this population with its ascetics and Brahmins, gods and humans, and he makes it known to others. He proclaims a teaching that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, and meaningful and well phrased. And he explains a spiritual practice that's entirely full and pure. It's good to see such perfected ones. Then, when the night had passed, they took many fresh and cooked foods and went to the forest near Ichanangala, where they stood outside the gates, making a dreadful racket. So that's our scene, that we're setting the scene. So what has happened, right? The Buddha has arrived with a large community of monks, of mendicants, right? So just a reminder, so the word for monk in Pali, bhikkhu, means a mendicant, right? So we have vows of poverty, right? So the early rules of the Sangha, we don't receive money. So here at this monastery, we don't receive money. I don't receive money or have money, and I don't buy food or make my own food, but rather we receive the food that's offered to us freely in our bowl. So you get bread, you eat bread, you get rice, you eat rice, you get pasta, you eat pasta, and you get nothing, you eat nothing. And you're grateful for that, right? So we remember, so the Buddha was wandering with a large group of mendicants. So, that's the scene. The Buddha was a wanderer. And if you look at the life of the Buddha, he traveled around. Guess what? How did he travel? Did he take airplane? Did he take Uber? Did he take an electric scooter that he rented in the city? No, he walked, right? He walked on foot. And that is still a practice that we do today. So sometimes when we're wandering, then we walk on foot, So we get around by three means of transport. Either we walk, we are invited and someone pays for our transportation and arranges it, or we don't go. We practice contentment. So those are our three ways of transporting ourselves. Now, if you develop meditation very deeply, then you can also, I guess you could also have a fourth way. You could fly or teleport. But yeah, that is a very difficult ability to develop, and most of us do not have that ability, right? So the Buddha was wandering, right? And he's wandering in the land of the Kosalans. So I'll go over this a little bit because we usually don't go over, who are the Kosalans? The Kosalans are actually the kingdom where the Buddha was himself from. So the Kosala was, you could consider it almost like the United States, or maybe a better example would actually be Russia or China, where within, say, Russia, you actually have autonomous regions, right? So for example, you have the Kalmyks, who are actually a Buddhist. They're the only Buddhists, I believe, in Europe, the only native Buddhists in Europe. And they're actually in Russia. So Russia is a large country, but within that you have smaller, independent, quote unquote, independent governing bodies of people who have their own ethnicity and their own religions and customs, right? So you can think of any country like that. China also, China has many different cultures within it, and actually it has autonomous regions, right, within China. So with maybe the native people in those regions might not speak Mandarin Chinese, They might not follow the majority of the cultural customs of the Han Chinese people, and same for Russia and so on. So these are examples of a larger country where within that you have smaller nations, right? Smaller groups. And so the Buddha was from a small group within a larger country called Kosala. So Kosala was the kingdom, and he was from the Sakyan Republic. He was a Sakyan, as it mentions later on. So he's wandering kind of in his native territory here, in the native country that he was part of. And he eventually arrives at a village of Kosalan Brahmins named Ichanangala. So this is a town which probably had been donated to the Brahmins. So Brahmins are religious, they were religious priests, right? There are still Brahmins today. So Brahmins are religious, they're a caste of religious people that you are usually born into that caste, and then you can pursue it, you can become a priest. And so the Brahmins were sometimes gifted villages, kind of like in feudalism, right? So for most of history, this is how it was. You didn't buy a house in the suburbs. You didn't look on Zillow, right? You had where you were born, or you settled in a new place, which was given to you by the king or something like that. So this was a town of Brahmins which had been donated. And the Buddha arrives there, and he's staying in a forest nearby. So the Brahmins and householders, the people who are staying there, they hear, it seems that the ascetic Gautama, that's the Buddha's clan name, he's Gautama, right? He's a Sakyan, gone forth from a Sakyan family, has arrived at Ichanangala. He's staying in a forest near Ichanangala. So they hear this, right? They know, it sounds like the ascetic Gautama. So why is he called the ascetic Gautama? Because there are many ascetics, right? The Buddha was not unique in that. So he's another one. So how do you can't say the Buddha, because if you're not Buddhist, Buddha is not his name. It's kind of like Jesus Christ, right? Christ is not his last name. Christ means Messiah, so Buddha is not actually his name, it's a title, right? So in the same way, they hear that, this is the ascetic Gautama is here, and he's a Sakya. So it's like saying, I hear that, I won't single anyone out, but if you say, I hear that Carlo is here, and he's from Venezuela, right? So there you go. You have a name, and then you have a country. And they say he has this good reputation, right? They say that blessed one, so the Buddha, is perfected. He is a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy or sublime, knower of the world, supreme guide for those who wish to train, teacher of gods and humans, awakened and blessed. This is the chant of qualities of the Buddha, 9 qualities, which we often chant, right? Iti piso bhagava arahang samma sambuddho, etc. So they hear that. So they hear, we hear that people say that he is arahang. That means he's worthy. Arahang is someone who's worthy of offerings. That means he's purified his mind, and so on. So I'm not going to go through the whole list here, because that would be a Dhamma talk in and of itself. But they hear that he has this good reputation. And part of the reputation includes that he has realized with his own insight this world, right? So the Buddha he's not declaring something that he read in a book or something that he believes blindly because his teachers told him, but rather he's telling something that he practiced to realize for himself, that then he declares for other people to see. So that's the next part. They say he makes it known to others, right? So classic example is Einstein, right? Einstein discovered a particular law, setting aside the details of how science operates, but he discovered particular things about the world, and then he declared it to other people. And you have students nowadays who know exactly what Einstein knew, right? So the Buddha had realized something with his own insight. He was able to teach that to other people and allow them step by step to realize it for themselves. And so he proclaims a teaching that is good in the beginning. That means when you first start out, you practice generosity and you practice virtue, dana and sila. Then it's good, it's nice, right? And it's good in the beginning, good in the middle, as you train your mind, as you practice restraint and contentment and meditation. And it's good in the end, as you develop wisdom and insight, as you start to answer those questions about life for yourself, and you start to see them. That's also good. So it's good in the beginning, the middle, and the end. Sometimes people find it brutal, right? In the beginning, the middle, and the end. But that's because they're actually not practicing the path. They're struggling with their own difficulties, right? So maybe you find it brutal to practice generosity. Well, that doesn't mean it's not good. It just means that you have to work through that, and then it will be good. Or maybe you find it brutal to follow precepts, right? You want to do what you want, and you want to do it when you want to. But actually, it's good to follow precepts. So sometimes things don't seem good until we get used to it. And it's meaningful and well phrased, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means what he says, it is both the meaning of it, the intention of the statement is meaningful. It's actually something which makes sense. He's not espousing a doctrine which sounds profound, but is really not meaningful. It is actually meaningful. So it has a deep meaning, but it's also well phrased. So it's sometimes people might say something deep, or they might be trying to get something across, but they don't phrase it very well, right? So they are saying something meaningful. It's just not well phrased. And sometimes people say something very pretty and flowery, but it's not very meaningful, right? Well, the Buddha, he teaches something which is meaningful and well phrased, right? That's our goal when we speak. And he explains a spiritual practice that's entirely full and pure. It's good to see such perfected ones. So they hear this and they think, well, it's good to see people like that. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they just have faith that he's a good spiritual practitioner, but they think it's good. And so when the night had passed, they heard the night, and they took many fresh and cooked foods, and they went to the forest, where they stood outside the gates, as I said, making a dreadful racket. So they're making a lot of noise. And if you've ever been to a monastery, you will know that sometimes that does happen. People might make a dreadful racket when they bring lots of food. So it's very normal. And now it says, now at that time, Venerable Nāgita was the Buddha's attendant. And you might say, wait a minute, what about Venerable Ananda, right? As they say in Thai, Pra Anon, right? What about Ananda? Well, actually, Ananda was only the Buddha's attendant for some part of his life. Before Ananda, Buddha had other attendants. One of them was named Nāgita, right? So that's his upataka. So upataka means he helps the Buddha. So like, for example, he helps with the Buddha's bowl, he prepares his robe, he does his laundry, he assists him, he gives him massaging and so on. So this is common. If you have a senior monastic or a monastic who is being taken care of, then you'll often have a junior monastic helping take care of them. Just like in many cultures, you take care of your parents, right? So when they're sick, you should take care of them, and you help wash them and feed them, and you respect them and massage them and so on. So it's the same in the monastic world. And so the Buddha always mostly had an attendant, it seems, once he was a well-known teacher. And so that's a very privileged position, right? When we attend on someone, it is really for our own benefit, because actually most of the time they can do it better themselves. It's easier. So you might think like, oh, it would be so nice to have servants serving on me. Actually, it's much easier to just do it yourself. It's much quicker, and you know how to do it. You know how it's best. So it's actually it's a chore actually to have someone else help you. So the Buddha, he does it out of compassion, just like most monastics today. Whenever someone has an attendant, it's out of compassion to allow that person to cultivate a heart of care and selflessness and respect and generosity. So it's really nice. It's very good qualities. So the Buddha had this attendant, Nāgita. And then the Buddha said to Nāgita, Nāgita, who's making that dreadful racket? You'd think it was fishermen hauling in a catch. So, people calling on the shore, you have fishermen and they're yelling, oh, we got it, look at it. And so he's saying, it sounds like there's fishermen. It's who's making that dreadful racket. The word is Ucca Sada Mahasada. So a very great noise. I'd say the word dreadful is maybe a bit strong. So the Buddha is not saying it's dreadful like he's having aversion. He just says it's a very loud, big noise, basically. So I don't know if I would agree with the word dreadful racket, just because it's, while it is funny, I don't think it's a little bit too, it implies that he is, kind of annoyed and averse at the sound. But actually he doesn't say, he's just saying, who is making that really loud noise? And then Nāgita, his attendant, says, Sir, it's these Brahmins and householders of Ichanangala. They've brought many fresh and cooked foods, and they're standing outside the gates, wanting to offer it, specially to the Buddha and the mendicant Sangha. So they want to offer food to the Buddha and to the Sangha, right, to the monks who are practicing there in the forest. And that's really beautiful, right? Offering food to the monks is really important. It's a really important practice because it cultivates the qualities that we need to develop in our meditation and in our daily life, and it kind of concentrates them, right? So if you struggle in meditation, Well, when you practice generosity, then you develop things like awareness, kindness. You get out of the past and the future, ideally, and you're just focused on doing something nice for someone. And while you're doing it, once you're giving it, and then after as you recollect it. And so generosity, it really cultivates the foundation of the practice. And then what it does is it makes your mind happy, it makes your mind strong, and it gives you a positive sense of self, right? So we don't want to have a very low sense of self-esteem or a very prideful, arrogant sense of self, right? Because if we have a very prideful and arrogant sense of ourselves, then we will cultivate unwholesome mind states, right? Our mind will be very protective, wanting always to protect its reputation, always wanting to assert itself. It won't be able to be quiet and still. And if we have a very low self-esteem, if we have a sense of ourself which is unrealistically low, which is any sense of self at all is unrealistic. So because it's not corresponding to reality. So any sense of self is unrealistic. So when we have a low sense of self-esteem, which means it's unrealistically low, then we cannot properly meditate. We cannot properly act in the world because we're always second guessing ourselves. We're always feeling bad for ourselves. We always have a lower mental state. So it's important that we have a balanced sense of self, and that is through giving. So this is important to contextualize because then we'll see what happens, right? So they want to offer food, they want to do something good. So it's very good, right? Giving is a very strong foundation. And then the Buddha says, he says, Mahan Nagita Yasena Samagamang Matamaya Yaso. Says, Nagita, may I never become famous. May fame not come to me. There are those who can't get the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening when they want, without trouble or difficulty, as the Buddha can, as he can, he says. Let them enjoy the filthy, lazy pleasure of possessions, honor, and popularity. Right, so I think this is relatively clear, right? So the Buddha is saying, may he never become famous. May he never have a famous reputation. And why? Because he's saying that the pleasure that comes from renunciation, from letting go, from being quiet, from not having people around you, from not needing to engage in the world, the pleasure that comes from seclusion, from a sense of isolation, right? A wholesome isolation. Like when you are alone and it's very quiet and peaceful and you're just happy to be there, right? You're not anxious or nervous or restless. The pleasure of peace and the pleasure of awakening. So the Buddha has access to those. He says he can get it when he wants without trouble or difficulty. And he's especially referring to the jhanas, right? He's especially referring to the jhanas, as I believe he mentions elsewhere. If not, there's other suttas where he uses this phrasing. So he's especially referring to the jhanas because the jhanas are called pleasure of renunciation because if you want to attain jhana, you have to renounce all of your hindrances and you also have to renounce all of the sensual stimulation. You have to renounce the 5 sense impingements of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. Eye, ear, nose, and tongue and body, what are called kamehi, right? So the very first phrase, the very first line of the Buddha's definition of the first jhana, which is for those who don't know, it's a deep state of meditation. The Buddha says, Vivicheva kamehi, vivicha akusalehi dhammehi. So, right, what does that mean? Well, vivicheva kamehi is quite secluded. So here it says the pleasure of seclusion. And this is the same word, very related word, I should say. Bhaviveka means seclusion, being alone, being separated from something. So the first jhana, the Buddha defines it as vivicheva kamehi. That means someone who has become secluded, someone who has become separated, someone has become withdrawn, kamehi. Kamehi means from sensual pleasures. So the word is in plural, which is important because sometimes it's translated poorly as like sensuality. But that is a different word in Pali. That's kama, singular. So when it's in plural, it means sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. So vivicheva kamehi from the 5 sensual pleasures, so the pleasures of the world, like nice music and beautiful people and fun events and concerts and dancing and makeup and sports cars and all of that stuff. So houses, money, food, all of those sensual pleasures, right? Even as much as like a nice massage, a pleasant feeling in your body, right? Like a bodily indulgence. Even something like that is a sensual pleasure. Even something like just enjoying the temperature of the air is actually also a sensual pleasure, right? It's a subtle one, but it's a sensual pleasure. So someone who's secluded from all of those, they're withdrawn from them. And then also, the Buddha says, Vivicca akusalehi dhamme, someone who has become separated from unwholesome qualities. And that is the 5 hindrances, right? That's desire, longing, as well as aversion, sleepiness, restlessness, and doubt. So that's the beginning. So when the Buddha says that he can get the pleasure of renunciation, of separation, of peace, and of awakening when he wants without trouble or difficulty, he's really especially referring to the pleasure of jhana, right? He can acquire whenever he wants the pleasure of jhana. And at one point, the Buddha says that he can sit still without moving for 7 days straight, experiencing nothing but bliss. You might think, okay, well, maybe a second, his knee hurts a little bit. No, because he's absorbed in the pleasure of his mind. So he can sit still without moving his body, experiencing bliss, pure bliss, literally unadulterated, right? Nothing but for 7 days, probably even longer than that, right? And so that's a lot, right? So he's saying, he has it. He has the goods, right? He doesn't need to go out and buy it. He doesn't need to go to the store and pick something up and then, do a few loops around the block and then talk to his neighbor. He doesn't need to do that because he has all the happiness in here, right? He has it all in his heart. So he's saying he can get that. So let someone else enjoy the filthy, lazy pleasure of possessions, honor, and popularity, right? Why is it filthy and lazy? Getting, possessions, getting money, honor, getting a nice reputation. Oh, you're so this, you're so that. Getting popular, everyone knowing you, talking about you, blah, blah, blah. That is lazy, right? It's something that you can't control. Sometimes you get possessions, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get gifts, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have a nice job, sometimes things go wrong. You get fired, you quit, you get, you have to take a break. Sometimes people honor you. Sometimes you're well talked about and you have a good reputation. And sometimes you have a bad reputation. And sometimes you're popular and sometimes you're not popular. And I keep repeating this, but these are what the Buddha calls the 8 worldly, he calls them the loka dhamma, the worldly dhammas, right? Pleasure, pain, praise and fame, praise and blame, loss and gain, fame and shame, right? So those are the 8 worldly winds. They blow us around, and they're filthy, right? Because it's like, oh, you have a lot of money, or you have a lot of stuff, or you're very popular. For the Buddha, that's nothing. It's very, very low pleasure, very, very dependent, very, very conditional, right? So it's like the mind of someone who is very lazy. Like they get their pleasure just when things go the way that they want them to from the outside world. Well, the Buddha, he doesn't need that, right? So he's saying, may I never become famous. He doesn't want to become famous because then it just gets you entangled, right? It just gets you caught up. And you might say, well, it didn't seem to work because 2,500 years later, we're talking about him on the internet in West Orange, New Jersey. So it seems that this man in the forest of ancient India did actually become quite famous, right? He became quite well known. But that was not his wish, right? So the Buddha taught out of compassion, not because he wanted popularity, because he had no need for that. Anyone who attains awakening, even anyone who attains the jhanas, they don't need that. So possessions, nice things, so on. At one point, the Buddha even says, he's talking to his disciple, Anuruddha. And he says, Anuruddha, essentially says, if you attain the jhanas, then when you're sitting under a tree, you're sitting at the root of a tree outside. So there's mosquitoes, there's no floor, there's no air conditioning or heating. You're just at the root of a tree. That's your house. That's your basic house. He says, it'll feel, paraphrasing, like you're living in a mansion on the finest, luxurious beds, like the luxurious velvety beds with cushions on either side and a canopy above them, because you'll be so comfortable, right, in your mind. And he says, when you're eating alms food, right, so you might get bad quality, little alms food, go hungry, have to walk a long time just to get whatever food you get in your bowl. He says it'll be like the finest luxury foods, right? He says when you're enduring the rag robes, the robes that you get from corpses in the charnel ground, stitched together and dyed with plants in the forest, it'll be as if you're wearing the finest luxurious garments because you'll be so comfortable, right? And when you're using medicine like fermented cow's urine, it'll be like the finest medical treatment. So sometimes as a monk, these are our 4 basic requisites. When we ordain, we are told your basic shelter will be the foot of a tree. Your basic medicine will be fermented urine. Your basic food will be the food that you receive when you're out silently begging. We're not even allowed to ask for it. We just receive what people give us. And your clothing will be the rag robes collected from corpses that are left abandoned. So that's our basic requisites, right? And the Buddha is saying, well, if you attain the jhanas, if you can, which is not easy. So let's be clear about that. It's not like just because someone becomes a monk doesn't mean they can attain the jhanas. It requires practice, right? So if you can, then you will be as if in the most luxurious environment, even with those very bare minimum condition. And the Buddha even says, monks, this lifestyle is harsh. It's extreme. People yell at you, you beggar, walking bull in hand. And yeah, that is true. Sometimes people say stuff like that. But he said, but it's worth it, right? Because actually you don't have to rely on the lazy pleasures of possessions, honor, and popularity. And as lay people, you can also practice like that. You don't have to walk around with a bowl in your hand and live at the root of a tree, but you can start to detach from those things, right? That these things are low. They are not the highest. Is this what you want in life? Or is there something more, right? Okay, so then Nāgita, his attendant, what does he say? Does he say, oh yes, you're so right, Buddha. You're so right. No, he doesn't say that. He says, sir, may the Blessed One please relent now. May the Holy One relent. Now is the time for the Buddha to relent. Wherever the Buddha now goes, the Brahmins and householders and people of town and country will incline the same way. It's like when the heavens rain heavily and the water flows downhill. In the same way, wherever the Buddha now goes, the Brahmins and householders and people of town and country will incline the same way. Why is that? Because of the Buddha's ethics and wisdom. So Nāgita is saying, oh, just give in, Mr. Buddha, just give in, because wherever you go, people want to follow you. They want to follow you because of the Buddha's ethics. The Buddha had very good sila, he had very good ethics, virtue, even in private. And again, when we talk about the Buddha, it's important to remember these are qualities that you can develop, right? So you might say, well, I'm not a Buddha and blah, blah, blah. That's because of that statement. That's because of that attitude, right? The tude there, that we don't hold ourselves to the high standard. Actually, the Buddha is saying that he teaches so that other people can realize it, right? He says there are people with little dust in their eyes they will understand. And there are people who can understand. And there are people who have understood. And so the Buddha had very powerful ethics. So even in private, even when he was alone, no one was watching, even his thoughts, even his mind was pure. It didn't have aversive thoughts, irritated thoughts, didn't have greedy thoughts, didn't have restless thoughts, kind of lazy thoughts, doubtful, unsure thoughts. His mind was rid of those things. So his ethics, his bodily conduct, his verbal conduct, and his mental conduct, both in public and in private, were very pure. So people want to be around someone like that, right? If you're a jerk, if you are violent and you tell lies and you don't care, you kind of steal and get around things, and you go drinking and you cheat on your partner, well, people aren't going to want to be around you. And what's worse, you ain't going to be around you. You're not going to want to be around you, right? Because we don't want to be around jerks. So why is it hard to sit alone in an empty room? Why is it hard to attain the pleasure of renunciation, of seclusion, of peace? Why is it hard? Well, one of the reasons is because we are sometimes jerks if we're not ethical, if we're not moral. So ethical teachings, they're for our benefit, right? That we follow them for ourselves, as well as to benefit other people. So we are the first to benefit, and then everyone else benefits. And also the Buddha's wisdom. So people like to be around wise people, right? You want to get advice from wise people. You want to see wise people. You want to know that wisdom is possible. So wisdom is another reason. So because of the Buddha's ethics and his wisdom, they want to follow him. And the Buddha then repeats, he says, Nāgita, may I never become famous. May fame not come to me. There are those who can't get the pleasure of renunciation, he says, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening, when they want, without trouble or difficulty, as he can. So the Buddha is repeating the same thing. Let them, those people who can't get that higher pleasure, let them enjoy the filthy, lazy pleasure of possessions, of gains, of honor, of fame, and of popularity. And elsewhere, the Buddha says that these three things, labha sakkara siloka, so the pleasure, the happiness that comes from getting things, having things, the pleasure that comes from honor, and the pleasure that comes from popularity, he says these are bitter and brutal. They obstruct and corrupt the mind. He says sometimes you might see someone who they wouldn't tell a lie even for the sake of their mother, but then they start getting a good reputation and people start donating lots of stuff, and all of a sudden they would lie. They start to lie in order to get nice things, in order to protect their sense of self. He says that this is like a dung beetle who is rolling a ball of poop, right? So a dung beetle is a beetle which rolls together poop. And the dung beetle thinks, haha, look how big my ball of poop is. And everyone else who's not a dung beetle thinks that's ridiculous. That's like a filthy, lazy ball of poop. No one wants that. No one cares about your big ball of poop. Well, the Buddha says it's just like that. So if we are bragging like, oh, look how popular I am. Look how many followers on Instagram I have. Look how much money I have in my bank account. Look how much honor and praise. Well, Buddha says that's like a dung beetle bragging about its dung, right? It's nothing impressive. So if it's better just to get over it, just to drop the whole thing altogether. No one wants to be a dung beetle. So if you don't want to be born as a dung beetle, then we have to get over that. Next, the Buddha says, take a mendicant living within a village. He says he sees them sitting immersed in samadhi. Okay, so he sees a monk living in the village and they're immersed in samadhi. And he thinks to himself, now a monastery worker, a novice, or a fellow practitioner will make this venerable fall from immersion. So I'm not pleased that that mendicant is living within a village. But take a mendicant in the wilderness, who I see sitting nodding in meditation. And the Buddha says he thinks to himself, now this venerable, having dispelled that sleepiness and weariness, will focus just on the unified perception of wilderness. So I'm pleased that that mendicant is living in the wilderness. Okay, I'll continue. Take a mendicant in the wilderness, who I see sitting without being immersed in samadhi. So someone just sitting in the wilderness, they don't have samadhi. He says he thinks to himself, now if this venerable's mind is not immersed in samadhi, they will immerse it. Or if it is immersed in samadhi, they will preserve it. So I'm pleased that that mendicant is living in the wilderness, in the forest. Take a mendicant in the wilderness who he sees someone sitting in samadhi in the forest, and he thinks to himself, now that venerable will free the unfreed mind or preserve the freed mind. He says, so he's pleased that that mendicant is living in the forest, in the wilderness. But take a mendicant who he sees living within a village, receiving robes, alms food, lodgings, and medicines and supplies for the sick, enjoying possessions, honor, and popularity. They neglect retreat, and they neglect remote lodgings in the wilderness and the forest. They come down to villages, towns, and capital cities and make their home there. So I'm not pleased that that mendicant is living within a village. Take a mendicant who I see in the wilderness, receiving robes, alms food, lodgings, and medicines and supplies for the sick, fending off possessions, honor, and popularity. they don't neglect retreat, and they don't neglect remote lodgings in the wilderness, in the forest. So I'm pleased that that mendicant is living in the wilderness. And the Buddha closes, he says, Nagita, when I'm walking along a road and I don't see anyone ahead or behind, I feel relaxed, even if I need to urinate or defecate. And that's the end. So the Buddha says when he's in the forest, even if he needs to pee or to go to the bathroom, he's very relaxed because no one's around. So it's not like that, right? If you're in New York City and you need to urinate or defecate, it's not the time, right? You need to find somewhere. And it's very hard to find public bathrooms. As a mendicant, I know, because if you need to go, you don't have a house or something, then it's hard. And I remember when I used to live in Argentina, sometimes there would be human feces on the street because maybe someone couldn't find a bathroom, though they didn't really have an excuse, honestly. So in the forest, you can just go to the bathroom wherever you want. There's no one around. I remember we have a forest monastery in Italy, and I was in the forest, and there was a man staying there. And I think he might have come across someone's old feces in the forest. And he was like, maybe we could get a toilet so that when we're walking through, we don't find people's poop sitting around. And also you often run into animal feces and so on, right? So yeah, well, when you're going, no one's around. So it's peaceful to be in the forest. Even if you need to go to the bathroom, you find that sense of privacy. So what is the essence, right? Did you understand? So he's saying that there's two types of people, right? There are people who live in the village. So these are called town monks, right? City monks, people who live in the village. And the Buddha is saying he sees someone who's living in a village, even if they're immersed in samadhi. So what is samadhi? Samadhi is the word for mental unification. It's when if your mind becomes collected, when it becomes together and unified. So like if you have a large room, right, and many people are talking, all having their own conversation and there's noise. Now imagine if all of those people came together in a circle and they were all focused on one topic, like they were all looking at the same thing, right? You might get a sense of this if you imagine, even if you're sleepy, even in meditation, you might be very sleepy or you might be very bored. And then imagine someone pulls out a gun. Now you're very alert, right? Very awake. So it's the mind which gets bored and sleepy. So samadhi, if you attain samadhi, imagine that everyone in your mind, someone just pulled out a gun and they're all focused. They're not distracted anymore. But now you extend that for a long, long period of time. So you don't need to force it. If someone pulls out a gun, do you say, focus, back to the gun, bring your attention back. No, your mind is immersed in that theme. It's just completely immersed because you are afraid of dying, right? So it's the same, but with a positive theme. So if your mind is immersed in the breath, you don't need to be thinking like, oh, back to the breath. Oh, breath. No, right? Your mind will be immersed. It'll be naturally, happily, blissfully immersed. And so he's saying even a monk who's in the village, in a town or in a city, right? He sees them in samadhi. So that's very good, very impressive, right? It's not easy to still the mind. But he's not pleased that mendicant is living within a village. Why not? Because he says, well, this monk that monk over there, they're getting samadhi, blah, blah, blah. But a monastery worker, a novice, or a fellow practitioner is going to make them fall from it. Right? They're going to go, where's the deodorant? Someone's here with the water delivery, right? Or they're going to go, I'm here for my residency, right? So people coming in and out. So even if you don't have samadhi, then you notice, okay, people coming in and out. Well, when you're in the forest, who's doing that? There's no one. There's no door to even knock on. So, all they can do is maybe yell, and you don't have to answer. I remember one time we were walking back to the forest, and it was late at night, actually, and we got there, and there were some people outside the gate, and they wanted to see the monks. And already you can relate to this story of like, once people start hearing about the monastery, they start showing up at the gate, and they're like, we want to talk to the monks. So yeah, don't do that. So we have a studio in town in Italy where we send people there. So don't go to the forest. So that way, if someone does attain samadhi, they are in peace, right? not disturbed. So the Buddha is saying that, yeah, it's really great if someone can attain samadhi, but a worker, so someone who's helping in a monastery or a novice or another monk, they will make them fall from it. So he's not pleased because he's thinking, well, that's not going to be very stable. But then he contrasts this. He says, imagine someone who's in the forest and they're nodding off, like they're sleeping like this. So if you've ever done meditation, you'll notice, what does it mean to nod off? You'll see it. People are like this, or you'll experience it yourself. You'll be like this. So that's what it looks like. If you're not meditated before, you might think that's really weird. What are people doing? They're like, it's because they're sleeping. They're falling asleep. So yeah, if you do a longer meditation, I'm sure you'll experience that. You'll just be sitting there and all of a sudden you'll be like that. So it happens. It's very common actually. So that's what nodding off means. So he's saying he sees someone like that, right? So it's an ancient thing. So if you're nodding off in meditation, you don't have to feel alone, right? Even the monks living in the forest in the time of the Buddha, they were nodding off. But he's actually happy that person, because he's saying, well, once they dispel that sleepiness, they're going to focus on the unified perception of the forest. So this is actually, kind of an obscure statement. There's one time in the suttas that I know of where the Buddha makes something like this. It's in the Chula Sunyata Sutta, the shorter discourse on emptiness meditation. And in there, the Buddha says, he gives a guided meditation. And one of his instructions is to focus on the unified perception of the forest. So he says, and it makes sense in this context, because in that sutta, what he says is, he says, monks, do you see that we're sitting in this hall, right? This hall in the forest. And he says, notice that this hall is empty of the loud, bustling, the hustle and bustle of the town and the village, empty of elephants, right? Empty of, as we would say, semi-trucks, empty of people yelling, right? Empty of the noise of stores and shops and advertisements. So he's saying that you notice that. And then he says, now notice, disregard the perception of this hall filled with monks. Now notice just the unified perception of the forest. It's empty even of people. It's empty even of buildings. So even of quiet buildings with quiet people, if you focus on the perception of just pure forest, there's no people there. There's no buildings there. So this is what the Buddha is, I assume, referring to, right? He's saying that even if someone is sleeping, well, once they dispel that sleepiness, their mind is going to be unified around the empty theme of forest. So it's empty of the village, right? Remember, he's contrasting this to the village. So in the village, it's very busy. So even if someone, is sleepy and so on, once they get out of that, their mind is already immersed in a certain degree of unity, a certain degree of just trees and grass and nature. And if you sit in nature, you'll notice that. You don't have to have deep meditation. You sit in nature and you'll notice your mind can actually be very peaceful if you're not, sleepy and restless. It's just very still. You just notice the trees, and it's like, it's actually very simple, right? It's very different from being in Times Square. So the Buddha is saying that he's actually very happy, even if someone is nodding off in the forest, because once they wake up, once they snap out of it, they're just going to be looking at a unified field of forest. So their mind is already going to have a certain degree of seclusion. Versus someone who has samadhi, so someone who actually does have seclusion in the village, it won't last. So that's a strong contrast. That's a very strong comparison, because usually the Buddha would praise samadhi, but he's saying that actually even someone who doesn't have it, they're better off in the forest, because there's really no reason except for their internal sleepiness or boredom or restlessness, which will pull their mind away. And even when they're not in meditation, their mind will already have a unified perception of forest, of wilderness. The word for wilderness in Pali is aranya. And aranya literally means not governed by a king. So it's not government. So what it means is unsettled, right? It's not a place where people go. So it actually could be like a desert. It doesn't have to be filled with trees. The meaning of wilderness in Pali, aranya, is a place where it's not a inhabited area. So it might be a cave or a forest or a desert or a very quiet, empty landscape, a mountain. So in a place like that, which isn't settled, then he's very happy with that person living there. And then he says, now if someone is sitting in the forest and their mind is not immersed in samadhi, but he thinks that, well, If they're not immersed in samadhi, if they don't have samadhi, well, their mind will attain it. And if it is immersed in samadhi, they will preserve it, right? So unlike someone living in the town, if they have samadhi, they'll be able to preserve it. And if they don't have it, they'll be able to develop it. So he's pleased about that person. So what is this whole sutta about? It's about the benefits of living in the wilderness, right? Isn't that, so yes, there is, it is pleasant to live in the wilderness. I mean, it's not all fun and games. Sometimes it can be, it can be suffering as well. It is suffering, but it is nice to live in the wilderness. So, I'm giving this live stream from a town. Now, thankfully, it's the suburbs. So the kind of the sound, what would be the sound of the rustle of leaves is it's the leaf blowers, right? And because they don't use rakes nowadays in this neighborhood, at least. And instead of the sound of the gentle breeze, it's a car driving by the neighborhood. So you have the suburban sounds. It's almost like it's nature, but it's not. It's like you won't believe it's not butter. You won't believe it's not nature. There's trees, there's leaves, there's wind and breeze. It's light and easy, but it's filled with people. So the suburbs are nice, right? They are relatively peaceful, actually. And actually, Empty Cloud is very quiet. During the day, when you're sitting in the meditation hall, it can be very quiet. And Mom, monk! There's children yelling in the park, and they see the monks. So sometimes you'll hear screaming from children, but mostly it's actually very quiet. It's very peaceful. So actually, we're blessed to be here. It's actually a very good place. However, the Buddha is saying, there are a lot of benefits to living in the forest. And that's also why we have a forest monastery, right? We also have one in Italy, because it's nice to go there. It's nice to be in the forest and to be hungry and be cold and sleep on the floor and, wake up in the night because of animals rustling around. Even, recently we had monks who were camping in the forest, and they also didn't hear the sounds of nature. They heard guns. It was hunting season. Hunters came up and they were bonding with the hunters about their love of nature, right? So we actually have a lot in common with hunters. There's one difference and it makes a big one. It's a big difference. So we love being in nature. We love, sitting around and so on. We just don't like killing the animals. So there are also hunters in Italy. And so even in the forest, you can be distracted. There's a story in the suttas of a monk, and he sees a hunter, and he goes over to try to convince the hunter. He tries to talk to them, and a spirit comes and says, "Don't even try." So yeah, it's actually true. I've talked to some of them, and it's just they have their ways, we have ours. So I'm sure that there are some who might change their mind, but I've never heard of a monk who then becomes a hunter. But I don't think I've heard of I think there are hunters who become monks. So there are drawbacks to living in the wilderness, but generally speaking, it's relatively quiet, right? Especially in ancient India, because nowadays there's very little that hasn't been settled. But in India, you would have had vast stretches of forest, which were much of it might not have been, there was no probably people settling in there for could be thousands of years, because it wasn't yet settled. It was not yet logged down. So being in the wilderness, being in an uninhabited area is very peaceful. I remember one time being in a mountain in Italy, and I've told stories about a mountain, but this is a different mountain. And there were horses on the mountain cliff. Just if they took the wrong step, they would have toppled down like probably, hundreds of feet. And they were just eating grass on the edge of this rock. And some of them had little bells, like ding, ding, ding. And you just hear that. And you see there's a little pool. And as you go to the top, there's a sanctuary that had been built for a Catholic angel and, abandoned and so on. But you look in there, it's a cave and very peaceful. So sometimes just being in those environments can be very peaceful, right? So even if you don't have samadhi, there's a benefit of being there versus being in the town and being around. So this is very good to cultivate that. Sometimes I've guided a meditation, which some of you may have even heard, where we imagine that we're alone in nature. So I do a kind of version of the emptiness meditation, the guided instructions of the Buddha, the beginning of them, but I have us imagine that we're in nature, and actually it can be very peaceful. So so what is this unified perception of wilderness? Well, to talk about this in terms of the practical, apart from go live in the wilderness, which most of you probably won't be doing anytime soon. So in terms of the practical, you can imagine that you're in the wilderness. It's not as good, but you can actually do that. And how do you do it? Well, you start by noticing what's present, right? And you notice also what is absent. So imagine a storm, right? It's pouring down rain. It's crashing thunder, bright lightning, wind blowing everything around, lots of noise. And then it stops and the sun comes out. And it's quiet, peaceful. And you think, so peaceful. But most of the time it's not storming. So why don't we always think, so peaceful? It's because only in that time do we notice that it's empty of disturbance. It's empty of storm. Or when you're sick and then you recover from your sickness, you think, I feel so healthy, so strong, so good. But actually most of the time you're not sick. But that's because you're noticing the emptiness, the absence of disturbance, the absence of sickness. So most of the time we focus on what's present, right? We don't focus on absence. A classic example is when we focus on the things in a room. I want you to take a look around you and describe in your mind, what is in this room? Maybe chairs and people and books, okay, lights. But actually, most of this room is filled with space. So most of this room doesn't have objects in it, right? And so space is actually even what the objects themselves are filling. So even if you take the object away, there will still be space there. So when we notice the absence, then our mind can expand. It can let go of a more coarse disturbance. Or, for example, when you are meditating and maybe some of your thoughts go away, you feel peaceful. And that's because you're noticing the absence of thoughts, right? So when you notice that things which were more coarse, which were more disturbing, have settled down and are now absent from your experience, then you notice a new type of perception. That is the perception of emptiness, the perception of negativity. So it's not a positive thing. Like you can't say, you go to the bakery and you say, 2 croissants, please. And the baker says, I'm sorry, we have no croissants here. You say, 2 no croissants then, please. It doesn't work that way, right? There's not no croissants on the shelf. There are no croissants on the shelf, but there's not 2 no croissants. You can't take a no croissant off and give it to someone, right? So absence of croissants is not a real thing. It's not a reality. If I say this room is now empty of elephants, I can't give you the emptiness of elephants. I can't hand it over to you. I can't point it out to you. And you might not have even thought about that, right? It is true. The room is empty of elephants, right? It's also empty of chariots. It's empty of fireworks. It's empty of Chinese New Year. So it's empty of many things. If we start counting them, this room will be very, very full, right? It would be so full that there wouldn't be space for anything else in this room. We'd have to take all the books off the shelf, all the chairs out, because it'd be full of all the things that aren't here. But that's because things that aren't here, they're not actually here. It's just a perception of the mind, which notices what's not there, right? So emptiness is not a positive thing, right? And that's important to make that clarification. Otherwise, you'll be doing it wrong, right? So when you perceive emptiness, even on a relative level, so just a relative level, you should not be perceiving something, right? You should be perceiving the absence of something. So how can you practice this? So you sit down and you notice, okay, what is here, right? I notice my body and my breathing, etc. But now shift your attention to what this room is empty of. You might notice it's empty of the disturbances of work. It's empty of the disturbances of lots of chatter and chit chat. It's empty of bustling family members. It's not like a Thanksgiving dinner or something, right? So it's empty of many things. And just like when you draw your attention to the calm after the storm or the health after the sickness, and you find peace there, you can find peace noticing what's absent. It's a form of gratitude. Gratitude is recognizing what's present and appreciating it. Emptiness meditation is recognizing what's absent and appreciating it. It is a form of gratitude. It's a negative form of gratitude, right? So you say, I have no money. I'm so grateful for all the absence of disturbances. I have no food. I'm so grateful for the absence of that disturbance. So it's like gratitude, right? So we're used to saying, I'm grateful for blah, 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 blah. Well, in emptiness meditation, you say, I'm grateful for no traffic in this room. I'm grateful for no life-threatening pains in my body. My body is so comfortable compared to a body which is being tortured in the chambers of a war camp. So peaceful. So imagine that you were in a war camp. Imagine that people were torturing you every day, and then you got out. You would never feel better, right? But actually, most of the time, you feel exactly that way. Your body feels maybe even better than that because you would be sore after all that torture, right? But you would feel so relieved. Oh, it feels so good just to not be tortured, right? So actually, most of the time, we're not being tortured. But then we feel a little bit discomfort in our knee. And, oh, it hurts. I can't meditate for any longer. Well, just imagine. It's relative, right? So you have to focus on being grateful for what's not there. Like, I'm so grateful. At one point, the Buddha, he's talking to a monk. And the monk says, Venerable Sir, I'd like to go back to his hometown, his home country. It's actually very far away. And the Buddha says, wow, the people in that area, they have a very fierce reputation, a reputation for being very violent and harsh. Right? You might say, well, that's a little bit biased. But actually, they have this reputation. They have they're violent, they'll assault you. And the Buddha says, what are you going to do if they assault you? If they yell at you? And he says, if they yell at me and curse me, I'll think to myself, it's wonderful. I'm so happy. It's marvelous that they're not beating me up. And he says, well, what will you do if they do beat you up? And he says, and I'll think, it's marvelous. It's so wonderful that they're not beating me with clubs. And the Buddha says, well, what if they are beating you with clubs? And he'll think, it's wonderful. It's marvelous that they're not throwing rocks at me. He says, well, what if they are throwing rocks at you? And he says, I'll think, it's amazing. It's so wonderful that they're not stabbing me. And he says, well, what if they do stab you? He says, I'll think, I'm so grateful. It's wonderful that they're not killing me. He says, well, what if they do kill you? And I can't remember, but he also says he'll find the wonderful aspect of that, right? I can't remember what he said. Do you have it?
He basically says, how wonderful, how lucky I am. Some people seek to be killed. Here I am.
Okay. Yes, he's saying some people would willingly try to commit suicide. So no, we don't advocate suicide or killing, just to be clear about that. But the point is that in the worst case scenario, you can always find happiness, right? So you might think, oh, it's so horrible to sit in this room and meditate for hours. I don't know why you would think that. It's wonderful to have that opportunity, but you might think that. But you think, oh, it's so wonderful. I'm not being crushed by a meteor right now. It's so wonderful. I'm not in a prison right now. So there's so many things to be grateful for. You just have to notice what's absent. Okay, so first you start out by doing that. So that's the basic emptiness. Once you know that, you have been initiated. You have all gotten my empowerment. You've all gotten my initiation. Not that I'm not making any special claims or anything. I'm just saying that you all have my initiation to now practice emptiness meditation. You don't need to go to a guru and pay them thousands of dollars. You just have to notice that you don't have elephants stepping on your toe. So once you notice that, you notice emptiness. And so then next time you go into the bakery and you notice, oh, there's no this or that, you can say, oh, you just practice emptiness meditation. Okay, so then you notice, okay, so this is empty of XYZ. Then you take that perception of emptiness. Say, okay, this room is empty of the hustle and bustle of the city. It's empty of traffic and disturbing noises. But what is it not empty of? Now notice what's present. Say it's not empty of, say, people and things and objects. Okay, so now just focus on the space. and ignore the perception of objects. Just allow your mind to settle in the feeling of spaciousness of this room. Or you can imagine that you're sitting in an empty field, a vast field with crops as far as the eye can see. No people around, just a clear sunny day with a light breeze. And really immerse yourself in that visualization. You can practice like that, and you can become very peaceful. I really recommend it. I wouldn't do it right now just because you'll be distracted by my talking. The field would be full of my voice. But you can notice in your meditation, just imagine being in that field. It can be very peaceful. And then you notice, well, this field is very diverse, actually. You'll notice, oh, it's very peaceful. It's empty of even what I was experiencing before. But it's very diverse. There's clouds and sun and wind and crops and shadows. So then just focus on one element, like just the earth, just the sky, just the sun, or just the wind, and allow your mind to become immersed in that perception. And you can go like that. You can empty out more and more and more. So that's a time of emptiness meditation. So you can even imagine that you're in the wilderness and really empty out. Notice, what does it feel like to experience a busy place and then to experience a place which is empty of that busyness? Both are just perceptions. They're just experiences that you're having. So you can also fabricate an experience in your mind of it being even more empty. Actually, all experience is fabricated, right? Mano pubbangama dhamma mano setta manomaya. So manasate pasannena bhasati va karoti va tatonan sukhamanveti chaya anapai. That's the Buddha. That's from the Dhammapada. The Buddha says, things are preceded by the mind, led by the mind, made by the mind. If with a pure mind you speak or act, happiness will follow you like a shadow that never leaves. So when we act in a happy way, when you're kind and generous, then the world seems brighter. But when you're stingy and you steal, then you're afraid of everyone. Protective things. So actually, your whole world changes when you change your mind. And it can be even more dramatic than that, right? When we make good karma, you can even be born in a very pleasant place. And why are you experiencing all those pleasant things? Because of your deeds, because of your mind, because of your actions. When you dream, you can be far, far away, and then you wake up. And there's a famous story of a Chinese sage who he said he one day fell asleep and he dreamt that he was a butterfly fluttering through a field. And then he woke up and he was laying down, and then he said, now I don't know. Am I myself dreaming? I'm sorry. Am I a person that dreamt I was a butterfly? Or am I a butterfly that's now dreaming I'm a person? Right? So actually our mind can fabricate very powerful experiences, both in our normal life and also in the afterlife and so on. So in meditation. So you can fabricate that experience. You can create that in your mind, emptying out everything and just imagining a forest or a perception of that. Immerse your mind in that. And then maybe the Buddha will be proud of you until when's dinner, right? So yes, he'll still not be proud of you for living in the town or the village, but you can practice. And then he continues and he talks about what we mentioned. He talks about someone who's living in a village receiving robes and alms food and lodgings and medicines, and they enjoy those things. So because they enjoy that, right? So it's like, nice food today, huh? Then you take a nice nap in your comfortable bed, your nice air-conditioned place, and then you so you have your comfortable blankets and clothes, and then you feel, I feel a little cold coming on. So then you take some nice, luxurious medicines. So see, when you're living in a well-supported place with the generosity of people, it's easy to become lazy. So you start enjoying your nice, comfortable clothing and your lodging and your food and your medicine. And that's why it's important to reflect. Every day we reflect at the monastery. Pati Sangha Yoniso Pindapadam Pati Sevami, etc. Right? Nevadvaya Navadaya Namandanaya Navibhosanaya Yavadeva Masakaya Satitya Yapanaya Vihingso Paratya Brahmacharya Nugahaya Iti Puranancha Vedanang Patihankhami Navancha Vedanang Rupade Sami Yatracha Me Bhavisati Anavajjajacha Bhasu Yarochati. So some of you will know what that means. And for those who don't, too bad. No, I'm kidding. So it means we reflect, why do we eat food, right? Because we don't do it for pleasure and for fun and for indulgence and to make our muscles nice and strong. Like, I'll pick the steak today so I can go out and have big muscles, or so I need to lose some weight, so I'm going to eat the rice and I'm going to eat the white rice, not the brown rice. So that's eating for adornment and for beauty and for fun and indulgence. It says we should not eat for those things when we reflect wisely on our food. We should eat just to nourish and sustain our bodies in our spiritual practice, right? Food is a fuel, right? It's literally fuel for ourselves. So we should think, this is for my practice, just to remove the pains of hunger, but without adding the pains of overeating, which can be very uncomfortable. So you think just right, right? Like Goldilocks, just right. So just the right amount. Sometimes even a little bit less than you need. Then you're a little bit lighter. At one time, the Buddha told the monks, because the monks used to actually go alms food in the evening. They used to eat in the evening, but now we don't. So we have rules against that. So, and also lay people at the monastery, they take that precept. So we don't eat in the evening, solid food, edible, meals. So at one time, the Buddha said, he announced this to the community. He said, monks, I eat in one part of the day. In doing so, I feel light and comfortable and at ease, and blah, etc. And the story is that at one time also, a monk was going alms round at nighttime. And as he was walking, there was a woman who saw him. A goblin, a ghost. What are these people doing out at night? And so she was very angry that these monks were going alms around at nighttime. So that's one reason why we don't go. And another reason is because then you eat at nighttime. It's already enough to eat at lunch. After lunch, we have a 3-hour break right now. We're having a meditation retreat. So we have lunch at 9. Usually we maybe finish by around 10 and so on. So you finish 2 hours later in the first meditation. If you ate a good, you didn't eat less, then what are you doing? Nodding off, as the Buddha mentioned. So you start getting sleepy because your body is heavy. All your blood is digesting the food. So it's very, that's one is enough. So just imagine morning puja, you had breakfast, and then you finally digest your food, and now it's time for lunch. Okay, now you eat, and then you're nodding off again, and then it's time for dinner, and then you're nodding off again. So the whole time your body is digesting food. It's insane. So why do we need to eat so much, right? Unless you have a very, a difficult, if you're working and so on, and you get tired, then okay, maybe 2 meals, but 3, 4 meals snacking, it's unnecessary. It's more than unnecessary, right? So the Buddha recommends eating little. And one of the monks said, yeah, I'm not doing that. I think if I did that, I would not feel the same way. And then he said that he would regret it. And then he came back later and apologized, and he started also eating that. So it's good to eat less. So what is the point? So when we start indulging in the things of our home and our life and so on, then what do? We neglect retreat. So in terms of lay practice, if you're a lay person, which most people who listen to this will be, then what this means is it also applies to you. You're not off the hook. So if you're a lay person, maybe you're not going to be, living in the wilderness on alms food, with 3 robes, but you will be noticing that if you indulge in food, in entertainment, in busyness and distractions, and you get too comfortable, then you will neglect your practice, right? You'll start neglecting meditation. Your meditation will be more difficult. You'll start neglecting sila, and you'll want to enjoy nice things. You think maybe a little alcohol on the weekends, and maybe a little promiscuity here and there. No, right? So the precepts it's easy to neglect them when we are indulgent, when we're distracted by the pretty shiny things, right? When we see the ice cream in the store, I want that. Well, we have to say, no, restraint, because there's a higher pleasure, right? There's a higher pleasure. It feels good to be virtuous. It feels clean. It's nice, better than indulging in non-virtue. It feels good to be generous, better than getting what I want and being stingy. It feels good to practice meditation, better than indulging and rolling around in entertainment and music and so on. So these things that fill the mind, we think, oh, they're so nice, they're so happy. Yeah, think that way. Keep thinking that way. See how it goes. But if you learn how to meditate, you can become like the Buddha, right? You just might be able to sit still for 7 days straight, experiencing nothing but bliss. Bliss, you can experience bliss better than anything of your senses. And so there's a lot of benefit that comes, but when we're distracted with the pleasures of the world, then we easily fall away. On meditation retreat, we're on retreat right now. Do you know what is the most important time to really focus on your practice? What is the most important time when you really need to apply yourself? Is it the meditation after lunch? Is it the morning meditation? Evening meditation? No, it's the time between the meditations. That will make the most difference. So if you meditate and then the bell rings, and you're like, oh, finally it's over. Okay. Now you start indulging in all your thinking and you start, now you've just unraveled everything that you just did. Now the next meditation is also going to be painful. So then you're going to think, oh, when is this going to end? And then finally, then you release it. So when you're not mindful, when you don't protect the mind after the meditation and before the meditation will always be an uphill battle. So actually the most important time for your meditation is when you're not meditating, right? Now, ideally, there shouldn't be a time when you're not, because even, as you protect your mind, that also is a form of meditation. But the point is that is the most important time. If someone was to not sit down and meditate formally at all, but they were constantly watching if their mind was going out, and they were protecting their mind, developing inner refuge, inner peace, and they were mindful and they developed a peaceful, calm mind, but they were very busy, never sat down to meditate. Another person meditated for 2 hours in the morning every single day, but after that they just went about their day completely as if nothing had happened. The person who doesn't sit down and meditate at all would be much better off. Both in their daily life, they would be better. They would be better with other people. They would be better in their future lives, and they would also be better if they do decide to meditate. So actually 2 hours of solid meditation with then no practice outside, you might as well just not meditate at all and just focus on the sense restraint and the mindfulness of your everyday activities. That will actually give you more benefit. And so, yeah, it's very important not to neglect these things. And when do we tend to neglect meditation and retreat? It's not when we're meditating, right? Because even if you're indulgent, you meditate maybe. But so what's the point is that when you're in a busy scenario, like in town or in a home, it's very important to watch the indulgence in the clothing, right? As monks, we have one outfit every day, same thing. It never gets old. And it's always in fashion, never out of style. So in Italy, you have many old towns and country, buildings and monasteries, and we're the only ones who match. Everyone else is not matching. So it's cool to wear one outfit. It's, nowadays it's actually become popular. So you can have just a few simple outfits, right? And you don't need to worry about impressing other people because you won't be interested, right? And then you can also just eat food that's healthy and nourishing, right? So no more fast food. Or it's hard to even call it food. So just healthy food to nourish your body. And you can have a simple bedding, right? You don't need to torture yourself, right? You just don't indulge too much, just enough. And then you just don't get intoxicated, practice mindfulness, and it supports you in that way. So that's the main teaching that the Buddha is giving here, right? So and then he says, someone in the forest, even if they get all those things, they'll be fending them off because they're living in the wilderness. So it's not comfortable to live in the forest and so on. So even if you get, these things, you tend to be focused on your practice, fending them off. Now, there are other times when the Buddha might, teach along the lines that wherever you're living, what matters is your attitude, right? Here, he's talking about the importance of external conditions. External conditions are also important. So it is true that yes, our attitude, blah, 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 yes. But also sometimes we do need to look at the externals. So, recently someone was asking me like, oh, we live in the city, they live in New York City, and they're saying, oh, it's so busy and, it's hard to find time. So how can we be more quiet? How can we have more seclusion? What a silly question, right? Because, you move, you go to a different place. That's how, right? Like, that's the answer. So it's the same. So if we have a very busy environment, then yes, it's true. Blah, 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 mental seclusion, it's all in the mind. Okay, you can say that all you want, but then if you keep getting distracted, then it might be time to reevaluate. Maybe it's time to move to a quieter place. Maybe it's time to take some time for retreat, take some time off work, off family, and have a real vacation, right? People say they're going on vacation to relax. What are they doing? Oh, okay, we need to see this site, we need to see that site, we're going to go there, and then we're going to go there, and then the hotel's wrong, and it's not warm enough, and there's problems in customer service, and then the renting the car, blah, blah. It's not a vacation, right? It is like you're going more places with your mind than you went when you were at home working. Your mind is traveling even quicker. You didn't even need to take a plane. You've already gone way far, so far away. So a real meditation is, take some time off work, go to the monastery, practice dana, practice sila, and practice bhavana, practice meditation. So generosity, virtue, and meditation. And that is a real meditation. That's a real vacation. So yeah, external conditions are also important. And then the Buddha, as I said, he ends. He says when he's walking along a road, he doesn't see anyone ahead or behind. He feels relaxed, even if he needs to urinate or defecate. So we can try to find that sense of relaxation and being alone. Many people, they struggle to be alone, right? And that's suffering. It's not good to struggle to be alone. So if you feel that way, that's okay. Also, the Buddha used to be like that, And so it's normal to struggle to be alone. That's why we practice, right? If you had no struggles and no problems, then you wouldn't need to practice Buddhism. So it's normal. But what you do is you just recognize, this is not to be indulged in. Like if we have a hard time being alone, then we should work on being alone. We shouldn't think, well, this is my destiny. This is my fate. This is my trauma or whatever. So we have all the excuses in the world of what everyone did to us and what we did to ourselves and our personalities and who we are and who they are and who we won't be and who we won't be. That's all false thinking. So what matters is, yes, our background and our personality, they will affect us. If we're very sociable, you might have a harder time being alone. If we're very alone, we might have a hard time developing loving kindness and community. But we work on those things, and it is possible to work on them. So it's good to develop this perception of being alone, Set some time for yourself. Even just at home, I really recommend that you set some time where you don't answer. You put the phone away, put the computer away, put the books away, and just sit there. Just be alone. So you're not alone if you're with your technology. You're not alone if you're with books. You're not alone if you're with thoughts. You're only alone when your mind is quiet and you're doing nothing else but being aware of your body and your mind. That's when you're alone, right? And so when we practice seclusion like this, we try to develop that. We try to develop that delight in being alone. And to circle back to before, for closing, you can do this by practicing, as I mentioned, emptiness meditation, right? Notice, you might hate being alone. It's very boring. But notice all the peace that's actually there when you're alone. You might be concerned, I have so many thoughts. My meditation sucks. Well, notice all the thoughts that are not there. Like you don't have to worry about a million different things. All you have is the random thoughts that come up, right? Notice the pain in your body. Oh, I have all this pain. Notice all the pain that's not there. All the relaxation you can develop. So there's a lot of things that you can be grateful for that are not there. A lot of emptiness to appreciate, even when you struggle. And so I really recommend developing that perception of being alone and that practice, that physical external condition of being alone. Okay, so at this time we can close and respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then we will answer any questions that might be. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay. So we have some comments and questions. We have some more people live, such as Julie, Bhumika, Sud, Marielle, Ryan, and Manal, and Manny, and Victoria, so others as well. Hello to all of you. And Sud is asking, how does this apply to us? Should one develop renunciation in lay life? I think that I answered. This was an earlier question, so I hope I've answered that, Sud. And if not, feel free to leave a question for this. But I feel that I've answered that relatively clearly. And then you say, would development of mental renunciation while being in the world, would that lead to jhana? Are there lay people in the suttas who have attained to jhana while not being monks? There are lay people who attain to jhana. Even today, there are lay people who attain jhanas. It's harder, right? But it's possible. So, notice that the Buddha was even saying there's town monks, city monks, who some of them might attain jhana, even if it's busy, right? So, you can imagine also if you have a relatively peaceful, quiet home and you have time to practice and so on, yeah, you can attain jhanas. What's most important is, like I said, what you're doing outside of meditation. So it's important to remember, as you mentioned, should we develop mental renunciation? Yes, that's what you have to develop, whether you're a monk or a layperson. So if you want to attain jhanas, but then after your hour meditation you go and indulge in all the sensual pleasures and the unwholesome mind states in the world, well, that you're not going to get there, right? So it's important to develop mental renunciation, like developing dispassion for sensual pleasures and dispassion for your mental defilements, mental irritation and desire and so on, restlessness, these types of things. So it's definitely possible. And Manny says, even a good meditation session doesn't prevent an angry outburst. Stress or other factors could be overpowering. How do we cope with this situation? Well, Manny, that would be good for monk chat on Friday, just because you're asking a more general question about meditation. So if you put that in on Friday for monk chat, you can even put it in now, early on, and we can get to that later on. And then Vanessa has a question, says, despite all of its benefits, how can we do our best to not be attached to seclusion, especially when we must interact with people on a regular basis? Yeah, that's a very good question. Something that can come up for monastics and lay people. And one thing that's important to develop is loving kindness. Because when you develop loving kindness, ideally, if you're if you're doing loving kindness meditation, like may everyone be happy, may everyone be peaceful, and you think you had such a nice meditation, and then you go outside and you see your roommate or whatever, didn't do the dishes. Well, it doesn't seem that you were practicing metta meditation very successfully, right? So we shouldn't fool ourselves. That's the important thing. Like if you are meditating and you are removing the hindrances, and then your hindrances remain very strongly, I would question, are you really removing the hindrances? Or are you just kind of doling out a little bit and finding some peace in that? Your mind should become impervious to externals within a relative, relative to how much peace you have, generally speaking. So like, this is what we were talking about this a little bit today, that one way to talk about this with seclusion, just briefly answering this because we don't have much time, is that if there's two ways of developing seclusion, and one way will cultivate aversion, and that is exclusive seclusion. So like if you're focusing on, I don't want any of that, I just want this thing, and you just focus on that one thing. That is also true of meditation. So if you develop meditation, like I just want to focus on this one thing, you kind of force your mind and exclude everything else out. Yeah, that might give you some peace. You might get a little bit of relief from all your thinking and so on. However, you will then be irritated and agitated because all you're developing is like a repression, a kind of forceful holding away. And so then when you finally release, you're not going to be able to withstand that. So even if you're not meditating, if you develop seclusion, like, oh, finally I can get away from all these idiots, and you focus and you just want to be alone, and well, that's not going to, it's not going to be a good type of seclusion. Then you're going to be annoyed and it's not actually very valuable. You might as well go out and help someone. You might as well be busy and do nice things. So the real type of seclusion is you want it to be inclusive. So you allow your mind to let go of the distractions and just settle with itself and be content. Then someone comes in and you're content. You're happy. You might prefer to meditate. You'll prefer to meditate and be alone, but you won't be like, broken away from what you were doing because your mind will have become more unified. So, like if you have if you're running and you slow down to a walking pace, you can't just immediately start sprinting again. It's not possible. So once you slow your mind down properly, you won't be able to just immediately, you'll have to work yourself back up to like an agitated state. Otherwise, if it's like meditating and it's like, okay, you're still, and then you're running, you're sprinting, and then you're still and you're sprinting, the meditation, something's going off. So you should be gradually coming down and then gradually getting more agitated. That would be a sign that that your meditation is going well. Now, obviously you'd have to work on the agitated part afterwards, but I would say recommending developing seclusion, which is inclusive, like inclusive of everything, but allowing it to drop away slowly and settling. Okay, we're almost out of time, so let's see. How to focus on ears rather than listening to inner fake voice. Sandy, that would be good for monk chat as well. Okay, and then Mano says, I seem to be missing why the description of lay people bringing gifts of food in honor of the Buddha's visit then jumps to a lesson on lazy pleasure of possessions. I can understand that a party atmosphere can inflate the ego. Perhaps if there was less pomp and show and the lay people respectfully arrived at a decent hour, this might have been more acceptable. Yeah, so really what the Buddha is more saying, he's not blaming the lay people. He's more saying that he doesn't want to indulge in the pleasures of fame and honor and possessions, right? So this is the balance that we have in Buddhism. So as a monastic, my practice is contentment. So like when I'm, out on the street with my alms bowl, I don't think, all these people should be giving me food. I think, I don't actually deserve anything. I own whatever it should be freely offered. Like it's not a trade deal. Like, oh, you did this, so then I'm going to give you this food. No, we don't actually deserve it. We didn't, we don't do anything for it. So we just expect, I shouldn't expect anything from anyone. But the lay people's practice is to be generous. It's the opposite. Like lay people shouldn't think, oh, they're monks. They should be content with little. Therefore, I'm going to give them just a little rice so that they go hungry. That's the monk's practice, not the lay people, right? That would be a stingy mind. So monks practice contentment with little and not being, not wanting to be popular and so on. Lay people practice giving and so on. So in terms of the relationship between one another, this is a good thing, right? If the monks were practicing like, I want offerings and I want popularity, and the lay people were practicing like, those monks should be, they're being stingy, then that would not go well, right? The monks would not be practicing well, and the lay people wouldn't be practicing well. So the way that we find a balance is that the monks should practice contentment and seclusion, and the lay people should practice generosity. And then we do that in a certain degree of harmony. So the Buddha is actually not blaming the lay people, but he's giving a lesson to his disciples and so on, that he doesn't want to become famous. He's not in it for fame. He just wants to practice seclusion. And then he turns it into a Dhamma lesson on the value of being alone. So remember that the Buddha is teaching not for his own benefit. He uses the circumstances as they arise to teach people skillfully. So he's thinking, we can assume, he must be thinking, this is a good time to teach his attendant, Nāgita, the Nāgita is thinking, oh, you should let the lay people in. And the Buddha is saying, now is a time to teach you that you should not indulge in this. You should practice in the forest. So he's using it as an opportunity. Remember, he has an audience here. He's not just talking to himself. So the Buddha he's using this as a lesson. He's not complaining about the lay people per se, right? So that's important to keep in mind. It's more a lesson about the value of seclusion than it is a kind of complaint about offerings, because obviously the Buddha taught many, many times the benefit of offerings. Okay, and then very briefly, Sudha asks, what do you think of Maranasati? That would be better for monk chat, but in terms, is emptiness meditation mentioned in the suttas? Yes, it is. It's Majjhima Nikaya 121 and 122. So I put the first one in there, so you can go ahead and read those two suttas if you want to get a better example of what the Buddha was talking about. Okay, so this time we will close with our sutta discussion. So thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you for listening and your attention. I hope that you do well and that you find peace and a relative degree of seclusion. And so this time we can close with 3 more sadhus and then say goodbye for tonight. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Have a good night.